Hi, I'm Pat Sherlock, and again, thanks for joining our webinar today. And for those that are new to our webinar series, we'll be sharing information regarding our research that our company QFS Sales Solution has performed. We improve hiring and development for originators, and our approach is science-based, and so that's the basis for the research that we're going to share today. Again, this webinar is Never Have an Originator Leave You Again, Retaining Top Producers, a very critical topic in today's market. What we're going to cover today starts with the war for talent all the way down to the practices about keeping your top originators. So we're going to be sharing what really matters in retaining top producers, and obviously I don't have to tell you about the war for talent. You live it every day. And every day is really, a combat day. And obviously, with the market changing, the war for good talent is obviously intensified. As a result, losing a top producer is not just costly in your volume loss or in your customer service, but really it has a lot to do with the manager's credibility. So today's call is really all about showing you the best ways to retain your top producers. Just to reinforce how important top producers are, research that's been conducted through a variety of different MI companies, when they talk about what is the volume contribution that top producers make, it really is very startling. The numbers show that the top 10% of top originators in any given company produce 40% of the volume. Just think about that. 10% of your staff are generating 40% of your total volume. When you ratchet the number up to include the top 20%, they originate almost 70% of the volume. These are real numbers, and certainly what applies in other businesses does apply in mortgage banking, the 80-20 rule. And the reality of it is that certainly reinforces why top producers are critical for your sales success. So why do we lose top producers? Well, that's a classic question, and if you ask any manager, it usually delves into 4 topics. It's always about money, it's always about products, and it's always about pricing in the back office. Those answers are the typical answers that any manager will give when they do lose a top producer. The research shows something different, and these external factors really are not the basis of why these individuals will leave your firm. And never should it be, it's very rare actually, that a manager will say, well, gee, it was how I managed that particular individual. So let's look at what does the research show and why these people are leaving a particular manager or a company. The real reason that it delves into that there's really 2 basics. The basics are, 1, there's a lack of feeling that the company or the manager cares for them. And 2, there's a lack of a defined future or career path. So as we all know, top producers, our critical originators, are getting called every day regarding job possibilities. But what ends up forcing the individual to now listen to the recruiter, to now listen to what the hiring manager is really pitching? It delves down to these 2 issues: a lack of feeling that the company or the manager cares for them, and a lack of a defined future or career path. Again, both issues lead back to the quality of the manager and how they handle the top producer. So when you look at what are the motivators for originators, including top originators, you're talking about, as we show on this slide, that there are 8 motivators of individuals. The 8 motivators, starting up at the top of the slide where you see recognition. The next is control. Money is a factor, and certainly the issue of freedom, developing expertise, affiliation, security, and achievement. They are the 8 motivators that psychologists will tell you, and certainly our psychologists do reinforce this issue, is what are the particular motivators of an individual. So any person and what this means could have any one of those motivators, and certainly people are different. But what's interesting about top producers, and again, we have looked at top producers really since 99, so we go back quite a long way in this research, and we find the top producers are motivated typically by two things, and it's not money. The first is that top producers typically are very much motivated by developing expertise. And the second issue is obviously these are achievement individuals. Let's talk a little bit about what achievement means. These are competitive people. As we well know, and part of one of the predictive personality traits is this high self-reliance that translates into a motivator of being achievement-orientated. So that is why when you look at the performance of a top producer, they really exceed whatever the company has as a standard, and they themselves have their own standard. So that's very reflective and very typical of what you would see in a top producer as a motivator. But the other thing that's very much as important, and we see this all the time with people that have taken the assessment, is that developing expertise is a high motivator for top originators. Let me talk a little bit about what that means. Developing expertise is all about, they have a model that they have built. Again, getting their business model better is really one of their drivers. That's why when you're doing training or you're investing in training, it's really worthwhile to have the type of training that's going to appeal to your high achievers, because these people love this. So again, when you're looking at what are the motivators for an originator, and top producers in particular, it typically will dovetail into the two issues. And again, it's not money. So it's all about developing an expertise and achievement. So when you look at, in the big picture, taking the motivators, how do they translate into practices? Well, McKinsey, which is a well-known consulting firm, they've shown that there's 5 practices that drive people to or away from a company. They are as simple as praise and attention to training. So let's look at them. What McKinsey has shown through their research is that praise from one's direct manager is critical for the person to feel cared. Likewise, getting attention from leaders is another issue that is critical for keeping an employee and retaining that. So the direct manager is the feedback person, and likewise the attention from top leaders is also a critical part for what satisfies the motivations of people. The chances to join a fast-track program, are you doing new things? In other words, issues where instead of just rolling it out, get the input from these individuals. They like to, and certainly the opportunity given to them to lead projects, especially in this marketplace where so many things are changing from a selling standpoint. These individuals are the first ones that really should be part of what you're looking at when you're making the types of changes that really our customers are demanding. And training, I can't emphasize enough that increasing expertise at the top originator level, these are the people that crave for it. Certainly things that I would suggest would be things along the lines when you're talking about social media. These are the people that will adopt it versus the ones that should adopt it and really don't. So McKinsey is pretty clear that the 5 motivators that they see from a practice standpoint are these that are on the slide today. So let's talk about 5 things that you can put in action and be part of your plan of retaining your top producers. And let's just address them for what we show on the slide. We talk about that the first part is, do you really know what makes your originators tick? Again, in our industry, we always think it's commission splits. We always think that it's all about money. But really, as we've already shown previously, what makes it tick are these motivators that individuals have. The reality of it is that each person is different, and how are you going to figure out and ascertain what is the motivator. I'll talk about that in a second. I'd also recommend that you hold what I call stay interviews, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the role that 360s play in knowing really what are the competencies and the improvement that the direct manager has to have in order to keep a high performer. And likewise, holding the managers accountable. Again, quite easy for the manager to say, well, he left because so-and-so gave him a higher split. That may not be, and certainly what I'm telling you today, that's normally not the issue, because the issue is top producers are recruited continuously, relentlessly, especially in this market. The real issue is, when do they decide to listen? And when they're starting to listen, they're going through what is called a disengagement activity, where they're now starting to really pay attention to, well, maybe it's not so great here. Maybe they don't pay attention to me. Maybe all these other issues start to really impact their decision process. And finally, the role that exit interviews play in giving you a real pulse of what's going on in your company. I've had many people that are top producers that have been part of our different studies, and I got to tell you that many times, and just recently, a few weeks ago, I had a top producer who called and said that he was leaving to go to another company, and he was telling the tale about what was his former company. They all of a sudden were trying to keep him, and of course, from his viewpoint, it was way too late, that he had already come to some conclusion. And from his viewpoint, what he said is they tried to retain me when they should have tried really a long time ago, and not just wait until I actually did something. So let's talk a little bit about the 5 practices that I'm suggesting and recommending that you put in place to improve the chances of you holding on to and retaining top producers. Again, the first part is you have to know what makes that individual tick. What we're showing here again is the slide about the motivators. I would suggest kind of 2 routes that you can go to figure out what makes a person tick. One of them is obviously the assessment role, which is really an objective analysis where you're looking at, and the person themselves is identifying what makes them tick. And likewise, the next side of it, if you're not using assessments, is to ask the person. The person will tell you. Again, what we're seeing is that these individuals want to be listened to and want to have an impact, but reality of it is the manager has to make that step to listen to what is really important to that person. Instead, what we do, and this is common in a lot of companies, we just assume that if the person's making a large amount of money, that should be enough, and it really isn't. So the first step is you have to know what individual, what makes them tick, and then you have to address as a manager how to handle that particular motivator. And the reality is, and that's what makes managing so difficult, is each person's different. You just cannot make an assumption that everybody is the same. The next part, the second thing that I would recommend that you institute is what I call stay interviews. Now, stay interviews are interviews where you are checking in on where is the individual mentally. Mentally, we change. We have certain approaches, and a stay interview is just an opportunity for you to have a conversation with that employee, and the conversation is to check into what do they like, what do they dislike now about their role. These individuals will tell you if you take the time to ask them. When you ask, the second part of this stay interview is to ask them questions about what skills do they want to learn. This is a great opportunity for a lot of veterans. Maybe it's time to send them to Harvard for they have executive planning conferences that are on sales. In other words, you be creative in this thought, but the reality is that these are the people that want to improve their skills. And if you can come up with a solution set, that's a wonderful way to keep them engaged. The third type of question you would be asking them during what I call the stay interview is what things makes you want to come to work every day? They will tell you, and you'd be surprised at what they say. Certainly, that's what we saw in a variety of different interviews that we have done over the years. And then there's the other issue of what things make you long for the weekend. Again, I would tell you it's more than just this issue of that the compliance and the regulatory side of it has taken over the industry. These are people that are going to really nail down other types of issues. I mean, I think it's a given that everyone is experiencing different impacts from regulation, but the truth of the matter is the top producers always figure out a way to overcome it and change their business model. And then finally, you need to be asking them, what forms of recognition do you most appreciate? I have to tell you, one of the top producers that we interviewed for one of the books that I've written talked about, they didn't really want tickets to an Aerosmith concert. If they wanted that, they'd go buy the tickets themselves. Too often what ends up happening, companies elect those types of things, which really are not the type of recognition that the individual may want. And surprisingly, many of the top producers, as you notice, as I showed you on the slide about their motivators, they may not want recognition. A lot of them, again, because they're achievement motivated, they're really doing an effort that accomplishes something that they mentally have established. So asking them, what recognition do you want, does tell you a lot. It is something that you should incorporate. It does translate into caring for that person. So when we look at step 3 and 4, here's really where the role of 360s come into play. Again, we don't see them that often in the mortgage origination world, but we really should. All of the best companies do that. Companies like GE, a lot of the top companies, they incorporate 360s, so they have a real feel for what is the employee rating the manager on. And as you can see in this slide, this is just a picture of one of our 360s, and the employee is rating the manager on, does the manager try to educate and train his staff? Does the manager hold people accountable? It's interesting about top producers. It's another reason why with top producers, if you're maintaining people that are underperformers and not addressing it, that really is an irksome issue with top producers. But again, what this slide is showing you is that this is something that you would measure and then come to a determination of really how good is that manager. And frankly, what I see at a lot of companies, the senior manager doesn't really know what's going on at the field level. So these types of questions where your direct reports, which would be the originators themselves, are really giving you a picture of what is going on. Unfortunately, because many companies do not use 360s, they really don't know. And as a result, the employee has no way of suggesting things that are issues, which is really what the role of the 360 is. It really pinpoints what the problems are. And finally, a practice that I would highly recommend that you would put in is putting exit interviews as part of your process of, again, determining what is the manager doing and is there a problem that is essentially arising because of how they are managing the individual employees. Exit interviews many times are done by HR. I highly recommend that you don't do that because what ends up happening is that you get a slanted kind of view of what's going on. I would recommend you hiring a third-party company. There are many of them that are excellent from a standpoint who do specialize in this topic, where you're really getting an insight into what does that person who just left you really think. Again, because it's acceptable to always cite money, we're always working on fine-tuning our pay plans, and that really isn't what the issue is, and it really is what we're saying today, delves back to the quality of manager that you have that is supervising the top producer. So again, I'd really recommend that an exit interview process be put in place, and this is very helpful for senior management to actually know what's going on in the field. And finally, the last part about what we are saying today, the retaining of top producers is really a function of the quality of that first-line manager. Whether that manager is a regional manager or a branch manager, the reality is, better that person is as a manager and their ability to give feedback in the form of showing the employee that they care, that's what really engages employees to stay. So when they're getting phone calls from competing companies, they're not wanting to listen and start the process of disengagement. We've listed up on the slide a website that we have that has some different ebooks that can help you with these issues. So today's takeaway is really about the quality of the manager. The direct manager is the key to retaining top producers. And therefore, when selecting and developing the manager is a critical effort that should be done by the company who's really interested in keeping a top producer with them. And as mentioned already, these individuals are really critical. So why don't we open it up for some questions before we start our conversation with Phil. Again, go through on the chat feature and please type any questions that you might have on what was already mentioned. We have one question where Mary asks, when someone decides to leave, should you try to save them? Great question, Mary. I get this question quite a bit, and I got to tell you that once a person, as I've already mentioned in the story that I was talking about before, once that person has decided, gone through the disengagement process, and they've elected to move on, the reality is you can attempt to try to save them, but as mentioned, what that individual said, which is common by most producers, is that it's really too little too late, and trying to just make it an issue of whether I'll match the money is really not going to sway the person. Even if the person does stay temporarily, the person typically is going to leave within the next 3 to 6 months anyway. So trying to save the individual is, again, the purpose of what we're talking about today is to do activities where the individual is really saved on a daily basis and not waiting for when the person has put in their resignation. Another question that we received is, what is the value of a sales award trip? The people going on the award trips, once you get out of the top 10% or 20%, companies really kind of reach pretty low. And the reality of it is that it kind of loses a lot of its flavor. So I would say that, sales award trips, make sense somewhat, but when there's limited resources, especially today when expenses are short, and really the issue is, where should you get your best return for your buck? I would tell you that the reward trips are very costly. Companies spend millions on these things, and reality, it might be better for you to invest in a different way, especially in things that develop the expertise of the top producer and increase their ability to generate basically more business. So great questions, and certainly it's pretty ingrained in our business that reward trips are almost a given at every company, but I would suggest maybe to look at it a little differently.